Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. According to Plastic Oceans, an organization dedicated to fighting plastic pollution, a plastic bag has an average working life of 15 minutes. But the life of this plastic, meaning how long it stays in the environment, is around 450 years. This means that a simple plastic bag used for 15 minutes will be around for more than 16 generations. Let those numbers sink in. Moreover, once this plastic is put out in the environment, its existence is not harmless. In fact, 100,000 marine creatures a year die from plastic entanglement, and approximately 1 million seabirds also die from plastic. But plastic does not only impact marine life. It impacts our food and water and the wider environment. On tonight's show, we discuss how exactly a simple everyday item is creating havoc in the environment. Joining us for this discussion is Maryam Shabir, who is an environmentalist, joining us from the Islamabad studios. Also joining us for this discussion is Alexander Kaufman, who is an environmental journalist, joining us from New York. Thank you both for joining us. Alexander, let me begin with you. How serious is the threat of plastic to the environment?
It would be difficult to overstate the crisis that we're facing right now. Particularly, you mentioned plastic bags. There are about 5 trillion plastic bags that go into the environment every year, according to the United Nations. And It's only now, at a time when we're finding whales washed up with their stomachs filled with plastic bags, having eaten them, believing them to be jellyfish, that we have actual bans that are coming into effect in some countries. But many say it's too late.
Yeah, so we did hear about this whale being washed up in the Philippines that had almost 40 kgs of plastic in its stomach. So when we're talking about plastic pollution, how damaging is it exactly for the marine life? Paint us a picture.
It can be completely lethal to species that are already facing problems from the acidification of the oceans from climate change, which is done through the production of plastic, which is often through petroleum-based products, and from just the problems that they face from the fact that their habitats are being polluted by other sources. You see a huge number of animals, not just whales, but sea turtles and other creatures that are eating these. And it's well known that there's the infamous garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific where you just have tens of millions of pounds of plastic of different sorts that have gathered in this place. And so as these things break down, they are turned into microplastics, which are appearing in seafood, are appearing in wildlife all over the world. And there are predictions that within the coming decades, there will actually be more plastic in the oceans than fish themselves.
Yeah, and that's a very, very alarming picture that you've painted there. And those statistics really do speak out. But while we talk about marine life further, I'd like to ask Ms. Maryam here, what do you think is leading to so much plastic going into oceans? What's happening at the end of the recycling process? What's happening? What's going wrong there?
Thank you very much, Meshal. First of all, I would like to talk about some figures that in the world around 25% waste is produced annually, and in that 80% only is plastic. So that 80%, if we divide into different continents and different countries, Pakistan has also a lot to contribute. In Pakistan, we have a lot of shopping bags in production annually, like 55 billion plastic bags are produced annually in Pakistan. And when tourists in the form of plastic bottles or these shopping bags then goes into oceans, it not only causes a threat to the marine life, but it also goes into our food cycle. Because when it converts into smaller particles, fish eats those and it enters into fish. And when we eat fish, it goes into a human body, and which causes a lot of health threats. Besides that, I really want to quote that there was recent very sad news about the Philippine sea where a dolphin, I should rather specify that species, the whale was died, and in that 88 pound was the plastic content in that. So it is really affecting marine life in a sense that it causes their survival very difficult.
Yeah. So, of course, you've mentioned here, Alex also talked about how ultimately the marine life, of course, is getting affected, but it does affect us humans too in the form of the seafood we eat and also in the water. There was a report that showed almost 83% of all water supply has microplastic present in it, which is very damning considering how dangerous that can be. Alexander, when we're talking about plastic and the problem being so very widespread, do you think it's too late to tackle it now?
It's certainly too late to tackle it in the sense that we could completely avoid these impacts altogether. I mean, they're already here. But to pretend as though it can't get any worse is a dangerously cynical perspective to have on something like this. It can always get much worse. It will only become exacerbated as we have warmer climates, more violent storms, and the sorts of phenomena that we're seeing happening around the world already. So, while it may be too late to avoid this already being a crisis, it can always be much worse than it is today.
So, Alec, you mentioned warmer climates and how that will exacerbate the situation. Tell us exactly what happens with plastic and the environment and climate change. Tell us how those are interlinked.
It's important to go back to the very beginning of the production of the plastic itself. Most plastic made from a petrochemical process that involves oil production and gas production. Now, it is very much a side effect of the types of systems and fuels that are rapidly warming the climate that we live in right now. So they are a symptom of it in that sense, but it gets much worse over time when these things are in the ocean and they're beginning to break down, and the chemicals that were involved in their production are seeping out and poisoning wildlife and poisoning these areas that we are getting much of our food from in many countries. It's easy to forget, especially in some places, that there are entire countries that depend on the seafood industry, not just for their own sustenance, but for trade. And when you have that kind of rapid change, you're not just disrupting the human health of people eating it, you're not just disrupting the environments and the animals living in it, but you could really devastate economies that entire countries have been built around.
Yeah, and that's a very strong point you're making there, that it's not just restricted to the environment, but to the economy as well. And if we don't take a hold on to this situation, it's just going to get worse. Maryam, can you tell us, while we're talking about plastic production, which industries do you think are contributing the most to one-time use plastic being produced?
So there are many industries which are contributing to the plastic production. Like I just mentioned, the shopping bag producers companies, and then there are other which are involved in utensils making, and there are a lot to produce plastic furnitures, and there are cosmetic industries as well. I specifically want to mention about the cosmetic industries that there are little plastic beads which are used in different cosmetic products which affect skin. It causes cancers ultimately. I just want to add another point that how it affects our environment. When the plastic bags goes into environment, it takes 100 to 600 years to decompose depending on its composition and type of plastic. So it not only damages the land and trees and other species, but also birds and animals as well. And it really affects their health as well, not only humans, but animals as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned here the cosmetic industry. And another report that was released which found how beverage industries and the food industries is contributing towards plastic packaging. It found that Coca-Cola has disclosed that it creates almost 3 million tons of plastic packaging a year. Now, Alexander, what is the problem with this? Using plastic from everything from wrapping to packaging, and its ubiquity cannot be challenged, of course. But what is the problem with this entire situation when we're relying so much on plastic?
it's wildly unsustainable. I mean, when you are looking at the way that we package things all around the world, I mean, certainly, I'd say the United States is probably the pioneer in something like this. And you can go into some American food stores and see an orange, that is still within its peel and protected by its natural peel, that has nonetheless been repackaged in a small container that is made out of disposable plastic. I mean, the use of this kind of stuff is just beyond the even basic necessity of, protecting a piece of food from contamination. So, I mean, it's impossible to imagine it not being there, or those types of options not being there for packaging. But thankfully, there are at least some pushes in some places to make biodegradable ones, to develop alternatives that are manufactured with things that are not actually made from petroplastics at all. And you are seeing somewhat of a movement around just doing it the old-fashioned way and carrying around, reusable permanent utensils, or relying on plates that you clean afterward as opposed to throwing them in the trash.
Yeah. And you mentioned here how an orange is wrapped in plastic, and one wonders what that has to do with the marketing of these products, which are everyday products, maybe making them seem as if they're more value added to them. We're also joined by Dr. Ghayoor Abbas, who's a chemical engineer, joining us from Lahore. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ghayoor. Can you just take us through the chemical composition of plastic, which causes it to remain in the environment for over 400 years?
Thank you very much. Plastics are made up of polymers. Polymers all the polymers are not toxic. So there are some natural polymers such as plant-based polysaccharides, and even the animal tissue such as proteins, they are also made up of polyamide linkages. But these natural polymers, they can hydrolyze and break down easily. On the other hand, the plastics which we use, like polyethylene or the PET bottles, these are made up of those chemicals which do not degrade easily, such as polyethylene, that is made up of carbon-carbon bonds.
Yeah.
And these carbon-carbon bonds, they don't degrade readily under the normal environmental conditions. Whereas the natural polymers, the polyamide linkage as in proteins or polysaccharide in plant-based materials, they degrade under normal conditions when buried under earth. So these petrochemical-based plastics, which we use polyethylene, because they are made of carbon-carbon bond, they are very strong. They need ultraviolet radiation to be decomposed. Since we bury these plastic under earth, they are not the UV influence, so they don't degrade, and they live to so long. Similarly, PET bottles, which are made up of...
Dr. Ghayoor, sorry to interrupt you here, but if you could just tell us, the audience, what exactly happens if you burn plastic?
Well, that will go back to monomers if we decompose it into monomers. But these monomers, propylene or ethylene, they are toxic, these are toxic monomers. They are not environment friendly. Whereas the natural polymers, when they break down, their products are environmental friendly.
So basically, burning of plastic will lead to greater air pollution.
Yeah, that will, because these are just like you're putting petroleum all over the earth, because they are these propylene or polyethylene. These are made up of petrochemicals. Those are generally buried under earth, but now you are exposing the whole earth with these monomers, which are present in petrochemicals.
And thank you so much, Dr. Ghayoor Abbas, for coming to us and taking us through the chemical composition of plastic here. Alexander, back to you. So the United Nations did state that every year more than 400 million tons of plastic waste is produced around the world, and only 9% of that is being recycled. So what is exactly happening? What is the failure on the part of the recycling process which is preventing plastic from being recycled?
The recycling system around the world has been broken for a long time. And the dirty secret that nobody likes to talk about is that the recycling industry depended for a long time on China's willingness to accept it and, recycle it rather dubiously. In many cases, it was in fact burned. In many cases, it was essentially poisoning entire towns and cities in China. And because China said last year that it would be no longer willing to accept the world's plastic garbage and recycling, particularly from the United States, you have seen huge backup in American cities right now and a scramble to put together new recycling plants in the country here. You're also seeing the sudden proliferation of different new garbage dumps all around Southeast Asia in countries that are willing to accept this waste from Europe and from the United States. So there is kind of a game of hot potato right now over how to handle this huge amount of recycling that there just isn't the infrastructure to deal with.
Yeah. And Alexander, I wonder here, is the problem also to do with the cost of producing plastic? Is it more cheap to produce new plastic as opposed to recycling it, or is that just a myth?
Well, that's right, and part of that, going back to the original argument about fossil fuels' role in this, it's important to note how heavily the fossil fuel industry and oil production remains subsidized, despite the fact that you have scientists from around the world, and particularly since the latest United Nations report came out about climate change in October, saying that we need to rapidly decarbonize and shift away from fossil fuels as quickly as we possibly can over the next decade if we want to avoid some of the most catastrophic effects of climate change. Yet, it remains true that, in the United States alone, there are $20 billion in subsidies that go each year to oil and gas production. And the United States is a wealthy country that does not by any means need to be rapidly producing oil and gas in order to pull its citizens out of abject poverty. Yeah. So, it's a much harder sell in a country that is still trying to create a middle class and tell them that they should avoid this fossil fuel model that has existed for such a long time. But right now, when you are essentially using tax dollars from around the world to subsidize an industry like this, it's not hard to see the case why, it's just a lot more economical to just produce more and more of this stuff and more plastic.
Yeah. And Alexander, hold on to that thought. Maryam, talk to Alexander about how producing plastic is cheaper than recycling it and what's exactly wrong with the recycling process. But do you think that if the recycling process, even in a hypothetical situation, is corrected, do you think that would solve this issue, or what do you think needs to be done alongside it?
I think world has produced enough plastic, and it's time now to, actually we are already late, like Alexander said earlier. We have to move to reuse, recycle, and reduce plastic pollution and plastic products. And yes, we should move to recycling as well, but we should also move to the alternatives. Like we have to look for the alternative products, and we have to look for the ways through which plastic can be decomposed by environmental friendly bacteria, which are on the lab scale right now in some of the developed countries, but that has to Maryam, be at larger scale to decompose plastic. But we have to first see the economy of Pakistan right now to that where we should stand. Right now, there are a lot of plastic industries where labor is dependent on that. So we have to look at this issue sustainably. So we have to first find the alternate of the plastic.
And Maryam, how far along do you think we are in terms of finding viable alternatives? And I wonder, when we talk about alternatives, are they real practical alternatives, or are they just ones that can be used in a very minimized effect?
So practically this can be done. It will take a little longer time and little longer path, but it is possible. Like if I quote the example of grocery, we go on shops and stores to buy different products, what we can do is that we can carry decomposable plastic bags, or you can carry cotton bags which you can use over and over again. And this is one sector where we can really change the habits in daily life. And then if you move on to other sectors like plastic industry, which produces plastic furniture and plastic utensils, they can also go to the metallic products which should be pro-environmental, and plastic furniture industry can move to the wooden furniture. And yes, there are alternatives available, but since plastic production industries has this cheaper way of generating a lot of economy, that's why they stick to that.
Yeah. So Maryam, you mentioned here wooden furniture, and something that I'm going to ask Alexander here. When we think of alternatives to plastic, paper often comes to our mind, but isn't it true, and please educate us on this, that while we use paper as an alternative, that too has harms? Aren't we just going to exacerbate the issue of cutting down more trees?
That is certainly possible. Paper is fundamentally a more or a less complicated process when it comes to recycling. So in many cases, at least in the U.S., you encounter a lot of cardboard or plastic-based straws as an alternative to plastic straws, and those are more often than not produced with recycled paper. It is certainly a concern that putting more pressure on the paper industry will increase logging and production like that. But there's also a long history of being able to have a healthy working relationship with forests. And when you have the right kinds of regulations in place to deal with that, there are productive ways to harvest trees, replant them, and in fact do a really healthy level of forest management in a lot of places that does help to reduce the likelihood of wildfires in big parts of the world, which, as we know, as a result of the climate change, which is, in turn being caused by this plastic production process, is becoming a bigger and bigger problem.
Yeah.
So it's easier to conceive of ways that you can sustainably manufacture large amounts of paper and maintain, healthy, balanced forests at the same time than it is to imagine, having a similarly sustainable relationship with the plastic industry.
Yeah. And sustainability, of course, here is a very, very important point. Maryam, last question to you. As an environmentalist, what would you advocate for to people in their homes, in their everyday lives, on how to minimize the use of plastic and what they should do, and also to policymakers?
So, Meshal, this summer season is also on the way to Pakistan. What I want to convey a message to audience through your program is that when you go to the tourist sites in Pakistan, like in summer season, there are a lot of tourists in northern areas. When you go there, please do not carry plastic bottles over there, and do not throw straws, shopping bags around lakes and around other tourist sites, and educate other tourists as well to not litter the environment.
Yeah.
And what institutions and governmental level can do, that they should place some segregation compartments for separate plastic and for other kind of waste to segregate, so that it can be recycled very easily. And the other
Maryam,
thing which we can do on daily life.
Yeah. So, of course, that's a very important point you made there, how we need to compartmentalize and better organize the recycling process and better organize the disposal process. Thank you so much, Maryam Shabir, for joining us and talking to us about this. We're going to go take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, since 1921, 300 individuals have died while attempting to conquer the mighty Mount Everest. 2/3 of those unfortunate climbers are buried under the ice sheets. Presently, more and more bodies are being recovered than they have ever been recovered before. These harrowing body recoveries reveal to us how dangerous, in fact, Everest is. But they also reveal another fact. Glaciers are melting at a higher speed today than ever before in the past. Scientists claim that 70% of the Earth's fresh water is trapped in glaciers. So what should we expect to happen when glaciers are melting at an unprecedented rate? Moreover, in the larger context, what is happening to the global water supply and what are water-related predictions for the future? We'll discuss all these issues with our guests today. We are continuing with Amar Kaufman, who is an environmental journalist joining us from New York. We are also now joined by Hamza Farrukh, who is a water conservation activist joining us from South Africa. Hamza, let me begin with you. So when we're talking about water scarcity, we're talking about the alarming claims we're hearing about how water will significantly reduce on planet Earth. What can you tell us? How many of these claims are actually, in fact, factual?
So, Meshal, thank you for raising that very important question, which I think speaks to a much broader concern about, in this day and age of, facts and, fake news. I think it's very important to establish the facts. And I think the majority of the concerns that you hear around the water problem are, in fact, grounded in, recent science. They're grounded in NASA looking at the world from a bird's eye view. They're grounded in, scientists coming together and predicting what the world looks like. As far as water is concerned. I think just to cite one statistic, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with 1,300 scientists, right, top quality across the world, have predicted the global temperatures to rise between 2% to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think so it's very important to take this very seriously when we hear that 1.2 billion people in the world lack safe water. That is a fact that we have to get comfortable with.
Yeah. So, of course, there are many facts that people are uncomfortable with precisely because their biases or their opinions do not reconcile with them. But Hamza, when we're talking about this issue, how soon can we expect us being deprived of water at a large scale?
So, Meshal, I think that goes to how you define us. Right? If you're looking at the global level, the us is already lacking water, right? If you think of, people across the world, when we say 1.2 billion people lack clean water, that's 1 in 10 people across the world. Yeah. This should be alarming, as it is. I have been very fortunate in my travels and in the work that I do to meet with those communities head on and hear their concerns. Whether that be in Pakistan, whether that be in South Sudan, Bangladesh, or now I'm sitting in South Africa, where we have seen what happened in Cape Town, a true recognition and reality of a semi-developed city, which, came across day zero.
Yeah.
They just did not have clean water. So this is something which is going to continue to accelerate. We're not talking about the next century. We're talking about the next 10, 15 years. I mean, Pakistan is sitting as one of, the top 7 most water distressed countries in the world, right? And we are joined by countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're joined by countries across the globe. And so it is important to recognize, number one, we're already in the heart of the problem as it is.
Yeah.
Number two, the statistics and the facts speak power to truth. And number three is we now need innovative, urgent, strong responses to this climate atrocity. We need strong, reasoned responses
Hamza,
to the
hold
warfare.
on to that thought. I do want to get to what the response should be, the global response should be. But before that, I want to bring Alexander into this conversation. Anders, so we were talking previously about plastic pollution. And the thing with that is that it is evidence of itself. You see it, you believe it. But when it comes to climate change linking with water reduction across the globe, we know that there are many climate change deniers out there. So imagine if I am a climate change denier, which I'm not, how would you convince me, telling me that climate change is causing water reduction?
Well, I'm glad, first of all, to hear that you're not a climate change denier. You'd be disturbed by the number of them who are in the American media. But what I will say is that, there are the same tangible images that you can point to that demonstrate this huge problem. I mean, in Pakistan in particular, that is a country that has more glaciers than almost any country on Earth. And you are seeing the rapid reduction of this ice over time. You can just look at 10-year satellite photos and see where the front of the glacier was a decade ago and where it is today. And anybody who can understand the basic logic of where their water is coming from and who live in the Indus Basin should understand that that is the water source, and there's this physical deterioration of the thing that you are getting the majority of your water from.
Yeah. And Alexander, do you think when we politicize the issue of water supply, it damages water conservation?
In the United States, a lot of that's asked around the issue of privatizing water supply. So right now, for instance, to bring it into a local example, there is a big fight in a small town in the state of Ohio where the mayor is looking to start his own private water company and tap into their very plentiful supply of fresh water from the Great Lakes. And be able to sell this elsewhere and become very wealthy. And there's actually no precedent for this in American regulations in that part of the world. So people are trying to figure out what are the ethics of this, what should be the legal response to something like this. And it's broadened into such a big fight that I think you're going to see on a much larger scale in many, many parts of the world in the years to come.
Yeah. And Hamza, while we're talking about this, and Alexander mentioned ethics, which brought to my mind the issue that we hear a lot when it comes to climate change, which is capitalism and climate change go hand in hand. So I wonder here, how much does industrialization, how much does the corporate sector attribute towards water scarcity?
I think it's a very good question. And unfortunately, there is a direct link between the past 60 years and the past 30 years specifically, and the increase in global climates. The decade 2001 to 2010 was the hottest on record. And there is no surprise that the number of corporates, specifically those focused on fossil fuels and the extraction of natural resources, are adding substantially to the increase in the global temperatures. So number one is to recognize fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel use, and to the extent that corporates are linked to it, and industrialization and development across the world are adding significantly to that crisis. I think the other part of the equation then is, what are the ethics around it? Right now, this is a sticking point, because if you speak to leaders in the developing world, right, and we saw this in the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, their stance is the US, the developed world, has been using fossil fuels for the past 150 years to spur their development. How come the developing world needs to stop when it comes to our development? Yeah. So I think the ethics are a bit intricate, and we've had leaders like, former Vice President Al Gore stepping up to the plate and, considering what that might mean and, trying to find some balance, but it's a very intricate issue. But what's important not to lose sight of in all of this discussion is where we truly stand. And where we truly stand, regardless of what the past has been, is we lack water, the climate is deteriorating, and unless there is a rapid, globally coordinated response, we all lose. It's not about the developed or the developing world. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about where, all of us stand.
And Hamza, hold on to that point there. We're also joined by Amar Guriro, who's an environmental journalist, joining us from Karachi. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Amar. So when we're talking about water supplies, and we're talking about the issue of the fact that almost 3.6 billion people worldwide are already living in water-scarce areas, can you tell us about what do you think is attributing what is the main factor, in your opinion, that is attributing to this water scarcity? And how much do you think it's related to the growing population?
Actually, thank you, Meshal. Actually, if you see in Pakistan, though the Pakistan is going through the water scarcity,
But we have still enough water, and we need to protect water from the pollution, and we need to take that water to those areas where we are not providing the water. Like if you see on the river Indus, it's a strip of around 100 kilometers where the Indus water is reaching. The rest of the Pakistan, look at the Balochistan, or the eastern parts of the Sindh and Punjab and many parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are not getting direct water of river Indus.
Yeah,
so these...
Mr. Amar, I register that point, how there is, of course, inequality in water distribution here. But do you think that water distribution, and let's move a step backwards here, do you think that it's climate change or the growing population or growing needs of our growing consumption needs that is leading to a greater alarming rate of water scarcity?
Yeah, obviously, climate change is a major the threat for the water resources. But in Pakistan, if you just see that apart from the climate change, the water pollution is contaminating the water bodies, and also we are wasting a huge amount of the water in agriculture. Like 80% of the total water we are using in 4 crops: the cotton, rice, sugarcane, and another crop. So these 4 crops are consuming the 80% of our total available water in the irrigation system.
Definitely.
So
and Mr. Amar,
that is a major thing, that how we distribute or manage the water.
And you've mentioned a very great point here about how we are using water and where it mainly goes. We're going to discuss this further, but thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Amar, and sharing your thoughts with us. Alexander, when we're talking about water, in the near future, there's going to be a shortage. There are many reports suggesting it, and those who research more and more into it see there is great truth in the fact. How do you think that is going to impact overall lifestyles? And I mean mainly for those people who are not living in water scarce areas. How will that drastically affect their lifestyles?
It's hard to tell with something like this. And when we were in the previous segment and talking about plastic pollution, I was thinking about this a lot. You know, there generally has proven to be a disconnect between even people, the most well-meaning of people who understand the environmental crises that we face, and the actual consumption behavior that they have. You know, people do not ethically consume necessarily, particularly under systems that don't encourage them or incentivize them to do so. So I think when you're talking about how behavior is going to change, particularly in places that don't have to worry about the threat of, you know, a day zero, as Hamza mentioned before, or you know, a major shortage of any kind, I think you really have to look to what the regulations are going to be like. You know, you really need to consider how governments are going to step in and force behavior to change, either through, you know, new regulations on companies that are discouraging, you know, the tapping of water sources and then the sale of that water privately in plastic water bottles that only add to the pollution and the crisis that we're facing, or just through the way that water is going to be, you know, shared among people or rationed or however it may be ultimately regulated.
And Alexander, the main reason for me asking this question was because we see that policymakers from developed nations, perhaps the reason why there isn't so much urgency is because they don't feel like the places they belong to will have to face a day zero anytime soon. But of course, water is a shared resource globally. And when we're talking about that, what can you tell us about developed nations doing, and what do you think the global community is doing in order to tackle this issue? And do you think they're doing enough?
Well, I think the short answer is no, they're not doing enough. And going back to what you were discussing earlier with Hamza about the ethics of this, you know, it's certainly true that you know, the wealthy countries in the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, the United States and Canada and the European Union countries, that these are countries that became massively wealthy by burning the huge amounts of fossil fuels that have helped to exacerbate this crisis in the first place, not to mention, you know, centuries of colonial policies that also help them to steal wealth from other parts of the world and enrich themselves. But, those countries right now are some of the leading forces behind keeping many of the companies and industries that have stood in the way of any type of substantive action to deal with this in the talks to deal with climate change. So when you look at the UN climate conference that happens every year, you have companies like ExxonMobil, you have companies like Royal Dutch Shell, companies that have been proven time and time again to have funded misinformation about climate change and have done everything in their power, and they have a lot of money to do things with, to try to cripple any efforts to deal with this kind of crisis. So I think when you're looking at how these countries can step up and actually be good faith dealers with developing countries in dealing with this, a good first step is to say you need to take the extremely wealthy companies that often fund the politicians that are running those countries and remove them from this kind of conversation, because it's just a bad faith act.
But how do you actually separate the politics from the discourse here? Because, of course, when we're talking about it, it's a global issue. I get what you're saying, and the point you're making there is very strong, but how can that be done practically?
I mean, it needs to be done with grassroots efforts in developed countries, and I think you're finally starting to see that in many places where, across Europe, you've had this student strike and this movement called Extinction Rebellion, that has been partially led by Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old student who helped to push this movement along. In the United States, you're seeing a lot of movement around, the Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and a movement called the Sunrise Movement, which has been staging protests and demanding clear action on these things. So, unfortunately, even at this advanced point in this crisis, we are only beginning to see the kind of political machinations coming into place that are demanding action on the scale and the scope of what the problem is. Yeah. But I think that, you're going to have these things start at home, because there is just simply not the amount of international pressure on a country as large and as powerful as the United States, or a region of countries as powerful as Europe, to do things like sanctions, or do things like, cutting off trade, that would put pressure from the outside on those countries.
So, Alexander, hold on to that thought. I want to take this question to Hamza too. When we're talking about what's to be done, do you think it's time for there to be sanctions placed on those countries who are damaging the environment? Do you think we need to interlink? Of course, it already is interlinked, but do you think we need to interlink it further, the economy with the environment? And do you think more drastic measures like these need to be taken?
So I think it's a very interesting thought that the line of thought that you're following here, Meshal. But I think what's important to keep in mind also is the way we're operating now, right? We live in a fairly globalized society where when you talk of corporates, who might be American companies, but they have operations based out of China, Africa, parts of the subcontinent. Yeah. So it is fairly interlinked as it is. So when you're living in a very globalized economy and you talk about a shared resource, such as water or such as the environment, there are two things that need to happen from my perspective. Yeah. Number one is at that macro level. Right, we're talking about the supra-governmental level. We're talking about the UN. We're talking about Americans getting in talks with India, Pakistan, other developing countries, and looking through what those intricate issues might be. And when we think of that, and I think sanctions are obviously a very drastic way of curtailing, and guiding an issue a certain way. What's needed beforehand, which has not been happening, is a proper dialogue. A dialogue that fairly discusses, and lays out the facts and says, here's what we owe you and here's what you owe us in terms of the responsibility to the environment. Yeah. And, we are living, surprisingly so in a world where despite Hamza, all these alarming statistics.
Yeah, and Hamza, shared responsibility, something that you've mentioned here, and it's a great point here, but since we're running short on time and I have another guest joining us, Francois Gemenne, who is a climate change expert, I'd like to end the show by talking about glaciers the way we started it. Mr. Francois, what do you think is happening on that front? What can you tell us about glaciers melting and how that is going to damage, or what's going to change in the water supply, global water supply?
I'd like to point out that this is not what I think. This is what science tells us. So this is what I know. And what I know is that mountain glaciers are melting at an accelerated rate, and so are the glaciers in Arctic and Antarctica. And obviously this will have very serious consequences for water stress. We should not forget that the glaciers are the #1 reserve for fresh water, which means that once these glaciers will have melted, then we will have serious problems of water stress.
Yeah. And when we're talking about these glaciers melting and 70% of fresh water being contained in them, what needs to be done in order to make sure that the water that is being released is somehow sustainably conserved?
Well, it's extremely difficult. I mean, the #1 thing to do is to curb greenhouse gas emissions. This is the only thing that will really slow down the melting of the glaciers. So unless we do that, the other possibility is to store fresh water, but that means that we will need to build immense artificial reservoirs, which are clearly difficult to build. Another issue to consider is that a lot of aquifers, that is underground freshwater reserves, will be contaminated by seawater because of sea level rise. So this will induce other problems of water stress, and there, the only solution will be to build desalination plants, which are extremely expensive.
Yeah. So, Mr. Francois, where do we stand right now? Where does humankind stand right now in relation to water supply and in relation to how we're using and wasting water?
Well, where we stand is that our greenhouse gas emissions keep increasing by about 3% every year, which means that in about 20 years, we'll have reached 1.5 degrees of warming. And clearly, at the moment, our storage capacities for fresh water are clearly insufficient. Too much fresh water is being wasted in agriculture, and not enough fresh water is reserved for human consumption. So we will need to change radically the model if we want to avoid serious water stress issues.
Yeah. And what do you think needs to be done at grassroots levels in order to ensure that we are moving in the right direction?
At the grassroots level, I would say the most important thing to do at the grassroots level is to make sure that we keep greenhouse gas emissions on a path that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. We cannot expect people, obviously, to build freshwater reservoirs, but we will need to think globally about the different uses of fresh water. And clearly, as I said, none of the fresh water at the moment is used for human consumption, and too much is used for agriculture or industry.
Yeah. So last comments on the same point, Hamza, here. What do you think needs to be done at grassroots level in order to ensure that we're tackling this issue in the right way?
Non-profit as well, which is called Bundes Shams, and which, what Bundes Shams does is exactly that. We're building grassroots level support, exciting our youth to become active stakeholders in this effort. And we are working with communities in South Sudan, Bangladesh, and soon in South Africa to leverage the resources that we have, use solar energy, which is environmentally friendly, to find a solution for the water crisis. And I think what you need really is for this work to scale up, for people across the globe to understand how important this message is, and then join the effort, one way or another, to support each other and get us across the line.
Yeah. And last question to you, Alexander, here. What do you think, Hamza mentioned exciting the youth. What do you think the role the youth is going to play in the future of conserving water and using it sustainably?
I would say that young people today are the one thing that give me some hope for how things can change moving forward. After generations of climate change and water issues falling on deaf ears and ranking low on voter priorities. When you look at polling of young people across the world, who are teenagers now, this is something that they really understand is going to impact their lives and impact their ability to live long
Right.
and process lives like their parents did. So I think that those are people that are really going to take this very seriously. And
Thank you so much, Alexander Kaufman, for joining us. Thank you so much, Hamza Farrukh, for joining us. Thank you so much, Francois, for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again tomorrow with more stories. Goodbye and take care.